Abdulla Galadari. I really appreciate you donating your time and your wisdom for us tonight.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
thank you so much actually for inviting me, Samuel. And I don't know if I do have any wisdom to share, but I'll try my best.
well, there's certainly knowledge, uh, and I'm sure there's wisdom. I've read two of your books, right? The one on the life and death metaphors, and the one on Quranic hermeneutics. So I've read those, and some of your essays that you have up on academia.edu. And that's of course why I had the idea of inviting you. I thought this is something special about your work, and I'd really love to hear more from you. And all right, so let's dive into this. I'm not sure if you've discussed this topic in the interviews that one can already find online. But I found this very intriguing. It's relates to a section in your Quranic hermeneutics book, right? That's the psychology, the science of revelation. All right. So, all right. So let me test you here, right? So in that chapter, the first page of it, you present three possible scenarios, theories, right, for how the Quran was produced. And you come down for one of them, and you give the reasons for doing that. So, is that enough of a lead-in for you to give us a summary of what I'm alluding to?
Sure, yes. The
Right.
first chapter of my book on Quranic hermeneutics is perhaps the most controversial, especially amongst Muslims, because I do talk about the science of revelation and what would be a scientific way for understanding how perhaps revelation um, uh, appeared, especially to Muhammad. At least that's what he assumed it to be. And I do bring basically like there could be three different ways that this could have happened. I mean, it is possible that Muhammad was passively receiving this revelation without any agency from himself, or perhaps basically the Quran was really just the you had like a very shrewd number of people who redacted it, and they were able to make all of those different associations, which I really find this to be a little bit of a stretch to
Mhm.
consider. um, uh, or perhaps that the third is maybe there is a psychological way to understand how these things could have happened, and the mind basically plays a major role, because many people, especially many Muslims, would usually ask, I mean, it's a taboo talking about the psychology of the Prophet and the
Mhm.
psychology of Muhammad and his psychological state and so forth, and if there is any kind of human agency and things like that. But to understand things, I mean, we all, whatever we experience as human beings, it is always mediated through our mind, through our brain. I mean,
Mhm.
specifically the neurons of our brain, because this is what allows us to really uh, like perceive the world around us. When we hear something, well, we're hearing it because our brain allows us to recognize the sound waves that comes into our ears, and then it basically sends those impulses to our brain to recognize what is being said
Mhm.
or what we're really hearing. Same thing with vision and so forth.
Mhm.
So even if the Prophet or Muhammad basically was perceiving something, his mind must have been playing a major role on how he was perceiving what he was receiving.
Mhm.
So so that's basically one of the things that I do discuss into the psychology of Muhammad, and basically what could have perhaps happened. And yes, there will be, of course, as I said, it is a taboo amongst Muslims to discuss the psychology of Muhammad. and the psychological state he was at. But in reality, I mean, one of the things that I do discuss in my chapter is that the Quran so many times says that, God is the one who brings down the rain.
Yes.
God is the one who sends rain, and yet we do know the science of rain. It's not,
Hmm.
it's not something supernatural, right? The rain is very much a natural phenomenon, and we can understand it in a very naturalistic way. It doesn't mean it precludes, it doesn't preclude that, God sends the rain. You don't have to not believe that God sends the rain to also believe in the science behind rain. And by the way, I mean, even now in the modern times, we have what we call cloud seeding.
Hmm.
So we send airplanes, and they basically send have some kind of chemicals on the clouds, specifically certain kinds of salts, in order to bring down the rain. So does that mean, I mean, philosophically speaking, if God brings down the
Right.
rain and we do cloud seeding, does that mean we are forcing God to bring down the rain?
Right.
so
Right.
so so those are some of the questions. But you see, I mean, I live in the United Arab Emirates, and we do a lot of cloud seeding lately. Like in the
Hmm.
past decade, we've been doing lots and lots of cloud seeding. But you wouldn't find any Muslim, even living in a Muslim majority country, doing lots of cloud seeding. You wouldn't find Muslims really arguing that we're playing God, or this is, something that only God does. Everybody simply takes the science behind it for granted. So why should we therefore not accept perhaps some kind of scientific hypotheses of how revelation also occurred? How different is that? Just as God brings down the rain, yet there is a scientific way and a naturalistic way to understand it. Well, God brings down revelation, and there could be a naturalistic, scientific way to also understand that.
Hmm. Hmm. Not to identify your own views with these authorities that I'm going to mention, but there may be some overlap, maybe some difference. But right immediately, from a Jewish perspective, I think of Maimonides and his theory of revelation, but also right, from an Islamic perspective, I know it was very controversial for many, but the Ibn Sina's doctrine, right, of revelation and inspiration. But what both of them share, right, is this attempt, right, in different ways to integrate the natural order, right, within this divine process of revelation. So, at least for me, that's what occurred to my own mind when reading those first couple pages in that chapter of yours, and I know in several interviews in this program, since I'm currently involved in say linguistics and cognitive science project, what I think of are things like the the incredible abilities, uh, mental abilities, cognitive abilities of autistic savants, some autistic savants, right? Of course, some of them have astounding numerosity skills. Some are able to hear a classical piano concerto once and then play it instantly and flawlessly. And one could give many examples, but in former ages, some people would say, well, this is like is demonic or supernatural or it's miraculous. But now we understand, right? We understand cognition a little bit better, and some of these skills that autistic savants on various places in the spectrum, right, exhibit. And so um, some of these skills are just mind-boggling. Now, Alan Snyder, who's an expert in autism, his theory is because we only have theories, right? His theory is that these individuals, their brains are wired in such a way that they are able to access directly knowledge in the subliminal regions of the mind that the rest of us can only access very in indirect ways, right? And there's somehow our indirect communication with a vast store of knowledge at the subliminal level, right? And of course, unfortunately, right, those individuals do suffer in other areas of their life, right, where they don't have superior skills, but on the contrary, right. So, but in any case, there does seem to be, a vast amount of knowledge, right, in our subliminal minds, let's say, or unconscious, however we want to call it. Some people like calling it the superconscious, right? So that's the last point I'll make. From a cognitive scientific standpoint, that comes to mind, right? That in a former age, right, we thought these skills were miraculous, but now we know there's a natural way to explain it, which of course does not preclude the possibility, right, from a theological standpoint, that God is behind uh, these natural powers. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but
Yes, I mean, I fully, of course, agree. I mean, modern neuropsychology explains a lot about many of what we used to call, as you said, the like unconscious mind or the subliminal mind, and of course, the vast knowledge it has, and how certain individuals are capable of accessing this huge knowledge that, our neurons in our brain actually has. Basically, like one of the things which I also discuss in my chapter is latent inhibition.
mm, mm,
Latent inhibition is basically what filters out. It's how our mind usually filters out lots of the things in our, like, subliminal knowledge,
mm,
so that we wouldn't associate things that don't necessarily correlate with one another.
mm,
However, there are individuals who do have low latent inhibition, which means that this filter doesn't work very well in their minds.
mm,
Their mind is not always filtering this
right,
knowledge and its association with many of the things that they see around them, the stimuli that comes to their mind. And without this filter, they would be
mm,
highly creative, making associations that most other people wouldn't recognize. To
mm,
them, it happens naturally because their mind is doing it naturally. And, and that's what I actually also argue, because in modern neuropsychology, if someone has low latent inhibition, which means this filter doesn't work very well,
mm,
in their minds. However, they have above average intelligence.
mm,
Then their intelligence acts as a filter to remove out or eradicate associations that really don't make any sense. And they will find associations that are extremely creative that nobody else was able to see. And they
mm,
will be highly creative and finding new ways of doing things that nobody else thought about.
mm,
And everybody would say, how miraculous, that's a miracle. How did you figure that out? And those individuals are highly intuitive. And of
mm,
course, intuition itself is a personality trait. It's a psychological personality trait,
yes,
which itself is also wired in our brains.
mm,
So basically, yes, like modern neuropsychology does explain a lot about what we once perhaps thought as humanity, strange things, or as you said, some people might have thought demonic, because
mm,
unfortunately, as you said, some people do suffer from those, like, if your mind isn't really filtering all of the stimuli coming in with the knowledge that you
no,
already have in your mind, then it may cause certain kinds of people to suffer in
mm,
certain ways. And in the past, historically, a lot of people thought, they might have been like possessed demonically or
mm,
something like that.
right,
And so that's unfortunate. But yeah, I mean, science has taught us a lot nowadays, and why not embrace what we're learning and
mm,
seeing how we could make sense out of all of this?
right. Well, I've often made the point. Let's see if we switch to physics, just for the sake of an example, a professional example. Um, right, a physicist, right, in their trained professional capacity. as a physicist, right, has no professional ability to answer yes or no to the question of, well, could there have been a God behind the Big Bang? Right. This is not in his training. This is not his purview. Of course, any physicist can study theology and philosophy, but it's the professional theologians and philosophers who can at least grapple with that question. Right. So it's outside their competence, right, of a physicist. And so, my personal views aside, I think that the best way to approach this, right, as someone who approaches the understanding and interpretation of ancient texts, right, scientifically, right, is to say that yes, we use all of the critical tools available and to try to perform exegesis, but as scientists, as historians, right, it is beyond the professional competence, right, to get into the question of, well, is there a God behind this altered state of consciousness, if that's what we want to call it, or something like this. Of course, I am a person of faith. I don't care about mentioning that publicly, but I think to be scientific, uh, right, we have to set that to the side. We can use it elsewhere, right, in works of theology, but as far as history goes, I'm reminded of that first page again in that chapter of your book, where you mentioned that this, I think it's the second possibility, right, where we're talking about, well, it's possible that we can explain the Quran by divine inspiration, but right, from a scientific viewpoint, that just leads us down theological and philosophical speculation. So I really, I am impressed. Let's put it that way, and I find that argumentation sound and salutary. So,
Well, thank
uh,
you. I mean, I think you're being too gracious. I don't think most readers might be that gracious, but thank you so much.
well, the reason I phrase it that way is it actually leads right into the next issue I wanted to ask you about, and that is right, this whole question, which you do delve into. I'll just mention the term, and you'll know what to say, and that is influence and engagement. All right. So, what does that mean for us tonight?
Well, that's a big question, and
Mhm.
I think really those terms have had a negative connotation within Islamic studies and Quranic studies, especially because how it was used by scholars in the past, many
Mhm.
with Orientalist twists, if you like,
Mhm.
because many Quranic scholars in the past they basically hypothesized that the Quran or Muhammad basically were influenced by Judeo-Christian traditions. And usually, a lot of the times when they do use like Judeo-Christian, it's usually just Christian,
Right. Mhm.
and only
Mhm.
knowing the Jewish part from within a Christian tradition. But usually, they basically said, the Quran and the Prophet was influenced by Judeo-Christian traditions and borrowed material directly from those traditions. And ever since basically the terms borrowing and influence have
Mhm.
become have had this kind of negative connotation, although it isn't necessarily supposed to be as such.
Mhm.
I mean, in reality we're always influenced by everything that we know.
Sure.
We're influenced by our environment, and so influence itself isn't really a negative thing.
Mhm.
So I'm obviously when anybody does any research, we're all influenced by
Mhm.
our the knowledge that we have and things like that. So influence itself isn't. in itself negative, but because of how it was used historically by some
Mm,
of the scholars, basically had this kind of negative connotation to it.
right.
And I think it's true with many other terms in modern times, where basically some people might consider or interpret as perhaps like racist if someone uses it, even though the term itself is not in itself racist, but because of how it was used in the past
Mm,
historically, it does have this kind of
mm,
racist
yes.
connotation with it.
Hmm.
So scholars today, I think in Quranic studies, the way I like to use it is engagement. The Quran basically engages with because it's not simply, it's not simply borrowing stuff,
Mm,
but it's actually actively engaging. It has um, uh, a good awareness of these traditions, awareness of that kind of material, and then it engages directly with it, and it's actively engaging. It's not passively engaging, so it's not just borrowing and I'm not doing anything with it, but
mm,
I'm taking it, I'm re structuring it, perhaps even reimagining it sometimes,
mm,
redefining it in other ways, and so
mm,
forth, and engaging with the individuals or with the audience who have a good background about it. And so it's more of perhaps, I think, what you write about is a conversation.
mm. Oh, right.
And maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about your thoughts about, the conversations that
Well,
um, uh,
well, first of all, to affirm what you said, I mean, influence in itself, right, is not necessarily negative. I mean, the term itself, right, after all, right, the etymology of it actually is quite nice. It means an inflowing, right? And so,
right,
from a theological viewpoint, that immediately makes one think of inspiration, actually, right? This flowing in, breathing in, right? But in any case, yes, you are correct. Of course, it does have negative connotations in the field because of the past use. Just like the word discrimination, etymologically, it's neutral. It just means to be able to distinguish, right? But it's usually now applied to, let's say, race, the subject of racial discrimination. So we hear discrimination, and rightly, our first reaction is a negative one, right? So I agree with you on that score. There were some scholars, uh, even in the 1800s, right, who were pointing out similarities between the Quran and the Hebrew Bible, right? But we should bear in mind that some of those scholars, when they did that, were not necessarily being biased against Islam or the Quran. And what I mean by that is because not all, but some of them applied the same methodology to their own religion, right? Like I'm thinking of Geiger, like, and he had applied this and said very negative things about his own religion, his own cultural background, right? So there's that to keep in mind. Now, you point out that you prefer the term engagement, and I use it as well in my own work. And I don't think I ever use the influence or borrow anymore. I just don't think they're salvageable, at least not in our generation. So I'll use the engagement, and also there's the language of, as you say, conversation, right? There's a dialogue, and I remember Hans Kuhn, the late Catholic theologian. I don't know if he coined it, but in his trilogy on the three Abrahamic religions, uses the term trialogue, right, to cover all three of the Abrahamic religions, and to point out that the conversation was had several intersecting lines, right? So just not from Islam to Judaism and Christianity, but also right the Christianity, the Judaism to Islam. There was this. It was a real conversation, in other words. But I introduced at a recent uh, conference, Quran Bible Comparative Studies Conference at the Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran, this concept, in my own terminology, of divine echo, right? And because I think that a pious person, a pious Muslim, can use this term to describe what's going on in the Quran when we come across similarity with the Hebrew Bible or the Christian scriptures. But also, even an atheist scholar can use this term, divine echo, because it's a phenomenologically correct description of what the Quran, just on the surface text, right, is portraying and claiming. And this is God speaking. And so when God when God pronounces some statement that is similar to something in the Hebrew Bible, then this is a divine echo. And I think a good way to understand this is, everyone in the field knows, and many Muslims are aware that there are many, but there's one echo, right, of the Mishnah in particular, right, that's very widely known, and it's of course the one about if you kill one person, it's as if you've killed the whole world. If you save a person, it is as if you've saved the whole world, saved a life, right? So this is well known, right? And then, of course, the just as well known is the echo from Psalm 37, right? My righteous servants will inherit the earth, right? So now, if we turn to the Talmud itself and the Mishnah itself, but in the Talmud, we'll find in many, many places God is portrayed as studying his own Torah, studying his own previous revelations, and he will cite verses, pasukim, right, verses from his own previous revelation. So what is happening in the Quran is exactly, I mean, speaking phenomenologically, is exactly what we see in the Mishnah, especially the Talmud, right? And so we have God citing the Psalms in the Talmud, just as we have God citing the Psalms, right, in the Quran, right? So I like this term divine echo. I don't know if it will catch on. Maybe not. That's not up to me. But I think that it's even better than engagement. But maybe it's just equally good. That's not for me to decide. But anyway, since you asked, uh, that's my own preference, is to use this term divine echo. So in the Quran, sometimes God tells us the previous revelation, the title of the book, like the Zabur or the Psalms. But usually it's done, let's say, anonymously, right? So God will just echo the Mishnah, right, or echo other passages from the Hebrew Bible or the Christian scriptures or the Jewish liturgy, right? So I just have settled on this terminology of divine echo. So,
Yeah, the Quran doesn't do things any differently than how perhaps like other books of the Hebrew Bible also perhaps alludes to or sometimes cites like other books of the Hebrew Bible, or even how the New Testament also
mm,
alludes to books in the Hebrew Bible or in the Jewish tradition and so
mm,
forth. So the Quran isn't making anything differently. So
mm,
I don't think the way that perhaps some of the previous scholars of Quranic studies use the words borrowing, because if we're going to use borrowing, then the book of Isaiah basically does something very, very similar.
mm,
The Gospels do something very, very similar.
mm,
So they're all either all are borrowing, or we should perhaps understand it differently. We've got an audience who perhaps
mm,
have a good background about these things which are being alluded to, and so they will be able to immediately grasp what the author is trying to convey. And what you're talking about divine echo, that actually also reminds me of another hypothesis that also existed, which is the dual authorship of scriptures.
yes.
Uh, and basically, because according, to Of course, many theologians, especially Jewish and Christian theologians, they would say that scriptures are have dual authors. You've got the divine author and the human author working hand in hand, and so there is this hypothesis that the divine author perhaps would insert things that even perhaps the human author did not recognize or realize,
Right.
how this actually connects with previous scriptures, as you say. So
Right.
there could be this kind of divine echo.
Right. Well, then that brings to mind. I'll try to run through this as quickly as possible. This brings to mind another topic I talk about frequently on this channel. That is Ferdinand de Saussure. His, of course, he's very famous, most famous in linguistics for his theory of the radical arbitrariness of language or radical arbitrariness of signs. Um, he actually repudiated that in his later years, but he never published, he never made that public knowledge that he repudiated it because he couldn't figure out what to replace it with. But he had another theory, which is called the anagram theory, Saussure's anagram theory, which he never published because he couldn't figure out if he was just being enchanted by um, coincidental patterns in ancient poetry or if it was something that was intentional, right, on the part of the authors, right? So one brief example I like to give is, all right, so in the Iliad, the hero warrior Agamemnon comes onto the scene at a certain point, and as right before he comes on the scene, you'll start to notice that the letters of his name and the phonetic units of his name in different sequences begin to proliferate before the name actually appears. And then it tapers off after he leaves the scene, right? And and sometimes you get like fragmentary partial acrostics, right, in these areas, but never published on it. But Roman Jakobson or Jacobson, this great Russian linguist, probably the greatest linguist of the 20th century, uh, his opinion was that, well, maybe a lot of those phonetic and letter patterns, right, that Saussure recognized and cataloged, maybe a lot of that was coming from the subliminal mind of the poets. Some of it was conscious and artistic, but much of it may have been coming from the training, or from what the training does to the subliminal area, right, of the mind. And I think Jakobson may have gone overboard and stressed that too much, but I think it's a combination. I think that's the best way to understand this cognitively and scientifically, because we do have, and Jacobson, told us about many poets, especially Russian poets, who later on took a look at the work they had done decades before. Later on, these poets would look at the work that they had composed decades before, and they would start to see all of these patterns, these intricate, astounding phonetic patterns in their poetry that they were not consciously aware of when they wrote the poems. Right. So um, now we can apply that mutatis mutandis, of course, right, to religious texts like the Quran or the Hebrew Bible, the Psalms, especially when we're talking about poetry, but maybe the genre, but maybe not restricted just to that genre, right? And so some of these, I think, what we can call astounding patterns in some religious scriptures, acrostics, acronyms, phonetic patterns, may not necessarily have been consciously produced, or the prophet may not have been consciously aware of all of this. This may have been coming from, right, an altered state of consciousness, from something beyond a conscious awareness, from the subliminal mind, which again, theologically speaking, doesn't have to preclude, a divine element, right, behind all of this. So,
Yes, I fully agree with your assessment here.
you know, all right, let's move on quickly. Um, Let's get to what I consider the heart of the Islamic revelation, at least according to my lights, right? Reading it as a historian. Um, it seems to me, I don't know if you would agree, it doesn't matter if you do or not, but I consider the heart of the Islamic revelation to be something to do with this divine name, Rahman, right? He's the merciful. And as you know, the basmala, right, which opens 113 of the 114 surahs of the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, right? So, and the Rahman and Rahim are both etymologically, right, related to the Arabic noun for the womb. This works in Hebrew and other Semitic languages as well. Um, but anyway, you've written quite a bit about the ramifications of this, right? The relation between the divine mercy and the womb. So, can you give us an overview of your lights on this?
Sure. Yes, I do discuss this a little bit in my book on Quranic hermeneutics, in which I do show perhaps the significance of the association between Ar-Rahman as the womb, as in Surah Ar-Rahman, and how it associates the beginning of Surah Ar-Rahman with Surah Al-Alaq. So those two chapters, and how they actually relate to one another.
Mhm.
And perhaps it may be a little bit easier for the audience to see it visually a little bit,
Sure,
to see what we're talking about here.
sure,
And basically, I will also show you um, uh, both in Arabic and in English, so that in
mhm,
case some of the audience know the Arabic, they can
sure,
see the Arabic side, and then they can also look into the English side. So
sure.
let me share my screen here. Okay. So one of the things that we were talking about is how perhaps Muhammad's states of mind was capable of linking things together that most other people were not able to do, because it simply perhaps came naturally to him in his state of mind. And looking into the beginning of Surah Al-Alaq, which many Muslims think that perhaps it might have been, it's one of the like one according to one of the traditions that it might have been the first revelation, and Surah Al-Rahman. And we could basically see, and I've color coded them so that people would be able to see the links between the terms. This is in Arabic, but let me show you the next, which is actually the English translation. Um, so in Surah Al-Alaq, it basically say, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." So Iqra meaning, proclaim or recite or read, depending on how you'd like to translate it. And then in the name of your Lord who created the human out of a clinging. And then Iqra or proclaim or recite, and your Lord is most bountiful. He who taught the use of the pen taught the human that which he knew not. And when we compare Surah Al-Alaq now with Surah Al-Rahman, in Surah Ar-Rahman, it starts with the most gracious, Ar-Rahman. It is He who has taught the Quran. He has created the human. He has taught him speech, or bayan, however you'd like to translate bayan. Could be speech, could be intelligence, or understanding, depending on how you'd like to translate it. But when we compare those at the beginning of both chapters, in Surah Al-Alaq, for example, it says, recite in the name of your Lord. And Ar-Rahman itself is one of the names of the Lord in Surah Ar-Rahman. And when it says, Iqra, which basically the term Quran actually comes from the word Iqra or Qara'a. And we see that also mirrored in Surah Ar-Rahman. And in Surah Al-Alaq, it talks about the creation and the creation of the human. And we also see that as well mirrored in Surah Al-Rahman. And in Surah Al-Alaq, we see basically that God is the one who teaches the human what the human did not know. And in Surah Al-Rahman, we also see that God is the one who teaches al-bayan, which is, intelligence or understanding, or however you like to translate that term. So we do see, regardless of why, we do see that there is, a very high interweb of intratextuality between Surah Al-Alaq and Surah Al-Rahman. And Surah Al-Alaq, and it was called Al-Alaq because of the clinging in verse 2 of that chapter. And when you ask, what is Al-Alaq? What is this clinging? And you open all the books of exegesis, and they will simply tell you it is the clinging of the fetus in the mother's womb. Well, why is it even there? What's so significant about the clinging of the fetus? Why didn't the chapter use another term, such as, for example, created the human from dust, for example, from turab, or created the human from nutfa, for example, which is basically a sperm? Why is it al-alaq? Why is it the clinging, and why is it so? But I think, one of the ways to understand it, you can always question the way I am imagining it to be. But I don't think anybody can question, the parallelism that exists. The only differences of opinion could be, why is this parallelism that even exist? But the way I imagine it to be is because maybe Surah Al-Alaq, when it is talking about the clinging, and it is, the clinging of the fetus in the mother's womb, as most people understand it. But the word womb in Arabic, as it is in much of the Semitic languages, is rahim. And rahim shares the same root as ar-Rahman. So perhaps in here, it's not really talking about the clinging of the human as a fetus in the mother's womb, but it is really clinging unto Ar-Rahman, clinging unto God. And those who cling unto God, God teaches them the Qur'an. God, teaches them things that they do not know. So that is basically how I actually try to interpret this. And of course, as I said, you may try to question why these webs of intratextualities exist, but I don't think you can question that the interweb of intratextuality does actually exist here. But maybe the fetus in the mother's womb, or the clinging of the fetus in the mother's womb, is simply a metaphor um, uh, of what these chapters are trying to convey, which is basically, it's talking about really clinging unto God. And which is quite interesting, because for example, in Arabic, fetus is called janeen, because it's janeen is from the term janana, which means what you don't really see, and we don't see a fetus, especially back in the days. Now, of course, we have medical tools in which you can use perhaps sonar or something, but back in the days, the fetus was unseen. So in Arabic, the fetus was called al janeen. And just as Muslim tradition basically would say Al Jannah, which is heaven, is in God's mercy, it's in God's rahmah. We would also say Al Janeen is in the mother's rahim. Al Janeen is in the mother's womb. And if we think of the metaphor of the fetus clinging in the mother's womb, well, how is the fetus being fed? Well, it is being fed, of course, the umbilical cord goes through the navel, which is in the belly. And the navel in Arabic is called surra, and the belly is batn. And the word surra has its root from sir, which is the same root for secret or mystery. The word batn is the same root for batin, which means the hidden or the inner. And so perhaps just as a fetus clings onto the mother's womb, and is being fed through the navel, which is the surah in the belly, perhaps those who cling unto Ar-Rahman, unto God, they are fed knowledge of the mysteries or secrets, asrar, about the inner meanings or the inner knowledge or the hidden knowledge or the batin knowledge of the Quran and of life. Or in other words, علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم, which means God teaches whoever clings unto God, God teaches them that which they knew not before. So the secrets and the mysteries of inner things that they had not had any idea about it before. So this is basically one of the examples I show, perhaps, of how Muhammad was capable of making creative associations. And Surah Al-Rahman, according to some Muslim traditions, Surah Al-Rahman is called Arus al-Quran, the bride of the Quran. And the tradition never explains why it is called the bride of the Quran. Well, maybe, perhaps, and again, of course, you can always question my analysis to it, but maybe it is called the bride of the Quran because it is actually describing the womb of which the clinging occurs, which is God itself. So God's Rahmah, or God as Ar-Rahman, is this womb, which basically um, uh, like humans are asked to cling onto. And of course, in my book, I also show how this could also perhaps be related to the Gospel of John, the third chapter of the Gospel of John, when Jesus speaks to Nicodemus about how people are supposed to be born from above or born again. And of course, Nicodemus asks, well, how can someone go back to their mother's womb and be reborn? And then, of course, Jesus tries to describe that there are two different kinds of birth. There's a physical, but then there's also the spiritual. And perhaps here, what the Quran is talking about is the spiritual. So it's not simply the fetus clinging onto the mother's womb, but the human clinging onto Ar-Rahman. So let me stop sharing here, and maybe we could discuss.
Yes, it's what you've written and what you've just summarized there is I say overlaps nicely with my own work. I think I first presented some of my ideas, which are very similar to yours, back in, I forget when it was published, my Christianity and Islam book, maybe around 2009. And so I can add this to what you've said, and then you can react to it and see if you think that this is plausible. There, I point out, I believe you do too, but there is this famous, at least for those in the field, a famous hadith Qudsi, a divine saying, right, where God explains that, I believe it runs that I have my name, I have named the womb, right, after my after the divine name Rahman, right, and so this Hadith Qudsi, at least, right, is making this explicit connection, right, between the divine name Rahman, the Merciful One, and the womb, right. So there's not only this etymological relationship, but a theological relationship, right, that's being just performed, right, or being made explicit in that Hadith Qudsi, right? So when we then turn to the 19th surah, the Surah Maryam, right, the name of the mother of Jesus, I remember doing counting up the numbers, right, creating statistics back in my grad school days on that, and noticed that, well, this we have the greatest proliferation, statistically speaking, of the divine name, Ar-Rahman, in that surah, Surah Maryam. So there seems to be some special relationship, right, between that divine name and the figure of Maryam, or Mary, whose womb, of course, right, is probably the center, right, of the story of Maryam in the Quran and in the Gospels, right, because of the idea of the virginal conception, right, of Jesus. Not virginal birth, but virginal conception, right? There's a theological difference that Christians, right, will probably get me on if I don't point that out, right? So the virginal conception, which the Quran also uh, posits or describes, right? And um, so right, in view of all of that, um, right. Also, there's now Angelika Neuwirth, right, wrote, I think, a brilliant chapter on the Kitab, right, and she points out in Surah 3, the Surah Imran, that ayah 7, verse number 7, where we find this term Kitab, mother of the book, or mother of the revelation, however one wants to understand it. It's immediately prefaced, right, by God saying that, right, to paraphrase, God is responsible for what is in the wombs. And then later on, after the mention of this mother of the book, right, we have the story of the virginal conception, right? Well, the story of Mary's conception, right? And so there seems to be this esoteric, in the sense of this subtle hint, right, in the phrase Kitab and the person of Mary, right, who is famously a mother, right, because she's an unusual mother, being a virginal mother, right, and so. Um, well, much more could be said about that, but I just refer the listeners to that chapter by Angelika Neuwirth on that. So, all right, you bring it back to the basmala, right, to the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is at the head of 113 of the 114 surahs, and it does seem to me that the divine mercy, especially as expressed in that divine name, Rahman, seems to be what Islam is all about, in quotation marks, right? For me, it seems to be that this is the message of divine mercy, and everything in the Quran must be viewed through that prism, right? Um, and there's much more I could say, but I'd rather hear you um, comment on all of this. And with my last statement, I know it's provocative, but everyone already knows I say this. And that is so, at least from my understanding, while there is no heavenly father in Islam, right, because this metaphor is banned, right, there is a heavenly mother, right, and that's the Kitab, right, which receives, right, two divine names are ascribed to the Kitab, right, and that is sort of mind-boggling in itself, theologically viewed, right. But let's say if we are talking about God's womb, metaphorically, of course, but it is God's divine womb, then we could perhaps understand how two divine names are ascribed to the Kitab, right? So it would seem that there is a maternal metaphor that is allowed in Islam because it's in the Quran, whereas the metaphor of the father, right, which we find throughout the Hebrew Bible, right, and the Christian scriptures, right, this is for whatever reason not allowed, right. There are some exceptions I've found, right? Some Sufis say, well, if you understand it correctly, it's not necessarily wrong. It's just that in Islam, it's because of the example that the Quran has set, right? It's not generally used. Right?
Wow. Okay. That's quite an interesting thing. And I like the way you brought all of these different things together: the basmala, the Virgin Mary, and the virgin birth, the conception, and so forth. Because you see, of course, there are historians who currently are working about on, where does the Quran get Ar-Rahman from, and there is some speculation that perhaps it's a South Arabian Rahmanan, which is the name of God in South Arabia, or the prominent name of God in Southern Arabia when compared to other parts of Arabia and so forth. But I like the way you actually work it out and see it, because you see some scholars are suggesting that the basmala, because it's using three of the names of God, Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. And they say, well, that perhaps, maybe if I would like to borrow your term, I don't know if I can use the word borrow here correctly, but borrow your term, echo.
Yes.
Because some scholars say that perhaps this is trying to echo the Christian Trinity, the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But if we get to think a little bit about it, well, the Son is, something that is born out of a womb. So, like for example, if someone is the fetus clinging in the mother's womb is basically born a child from that womb, right? So,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
so it's the Son. And if we look into it from a Christian perspective, for example, in terms of the concept of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, well, the virgin conception was when the Holy Spirit basically came upon Mary, and that is how the virgin conception occurred, according to the Gospel of Luke. So we see that the Holy Spirit basically had much to do with the conception birth. And of course, the birth of the Son itself came out of that womb. And so is the Basmala echoing, Ar-Rahman is an echo of the one being born from Ar-Rahim, from the womb, and Ar-Rahim is the womb, the Holy Spirit. And in some way, it's trying to parallel that. It is a possibility. Um, uh, and of course, Surat Maryam, when we do look into Surat Maryam, the name Allah, of course, exists in many of the passages, but the term Ar-Rahman or the name Ar-Rahman exists even more frequent than the general Allah. So if is Surat Maryam and the term Ar-Rahman and the emphasis on the womb of Mary, does that also have some kind of association? That is also a possibility. I mean, there are some Christian theologians who had argued that when we look into the Gospel of John, we do not really see Mary pretty much, having a big role in um, uh, in the conception of Jesus or in Jesus himself, because you would see, like, even when Jesus speaks to his mother, like, he calls her woman, like things like that. So there is this kind of, Mary is not given what is expected of her, perhaps, to be given by the faithful. However, some theologians say, well, maybe because the author of John was trying to emphasize the divine birth rather than the physical birth. And that is why, even in chapter 3, which I was talking about, where Jesus speaks to Nicodemus, speaking about the two different kinds of birth, the physical and the spiritual, it is after that discussion we get John 3:16, the famous verse, and God so loved the
That's right.
world that God sent. So you would see that that's what the author of John is trying to emphasize, is the spiritual rather than the physical birth. So is the Quran sometimes, as you said, esoterically, very subtly, talking about this divine feminine, um, uh, the um, the divine role in um, uh, basically bringing in like compassion, mercy, and so forth, which is all, feminine kind of terms that are used. It is possible. It is very much possible. Although I would also say that we may also find divine masculinity, not only divine femininity in the Quran, but even maybe divine masculinity. Actually, Surah Maryam starts off with the story of Zechariah,
Mhm.
and Zechariah basically wanted to have a son, and uh, and what's interesting is that in the beginning of that chapter, in Surah Maryam, it basically says, the remembrance of your Lord, or sorry, the remembrance of the mercy of your Lord towards his servant Zechariah. And by the way, Zechariah, of course, literally means the Lord remembered.
Mm,
So we
yes.
already see this kind of parallelism, a remembrance of the mercy of your Lord towards his servant Zechariah. So as if it is saying, a remembrance of the mercy of your Lord, his servant, the Lord remembered. But what is quite interesting in this passage is, well, Zechariah wanted to have a son. Well, how do you get a son, physically speaking? I mean, how does the conception of a son occur? Let me share my screen. Let's see here. So this is the passage in here, a remembrance of the mercy of your Lord towards his servant Zechariah. And again, I'm color coding. And well, how do you get a son? How is conception physically happening? Well, the word in Arabic for remembrance is dhikr, and the word for mercy is rahma. And dhikr shares the same root as dhakar, which is the male organ. And rahma shares, of course, the same root as rahim, which is the womb. So it's when the male organ gets into the womb. That's how conception occurs. Like when the fluid of the masculine gets into the feminine womb. We could even imagine it just like in Hinduism. I mean, you've got the divine masculine and the divine feminine, both in their works of creation here. So dhikrullah is masculine, and rahmatullah is the feminine, perhaps.
Yeah, that's extraordinarily fascinating. To go back to the Gospel of John, I would say that what stands out in that Gospel is that the name of Jesus' mother, which is Mary, is never mentioned, not once. Right. So that the commentators, deal with that in different ways. One is, as you mentioned, another exegesis is that, well, maybe she's called woman and mother in order to turn her or to emphasize her symbolic, uh, well, her symbolism, right? And so I think there people would invoke the idea, goes back at least to Saint Irenaeus, of Mary as the second Eve, right? So this type of Christian symbolism. But in any case, that makes an extraordinarily intriguing contrast with the Quran, because throughout the Quran, the only woman's name that ever appears is Maryam, is Mary, right? And
Right,
so this to me seems to suggest or indicate that there is something very, very, very special about the story or the person of Maryam in the Quran. And I don't know if I stated this clearly, and that is that the number of times, right, that the divine name Ar-Rahman occurs in Surah Maryam, right, is more than in any other, by far more than in any other surah of the Quran. So I think that to an attentive hearer or reader, that the question is justified, right? Is there a reason for this? Right? Is it more than just coincidence? And so also, I would point out very quickly, since I've been writing on it, it's like that the opening of the Surah Maryam, I believe you were just mentioning, right? This idea of remembrance, right, seems to me one of these divine echoes of the Song of Hannah, right, in the book of Samuel, right, where Hannah says that the Lord has remembered her, right? So brought her out of the barrenness to the capacity of bearing a child, right? And so because the Song of Hannah, right, is this, everyone knows it's echoed in the Magnificat, the song of the Virgin Mary in the Gospel of Luke, right? And so it's this like this, yes, this very complex, very impressive web of intertextual web, right, of New Testament and Tanakh, right, in this story in the Quran, involving uh, Zechariah. Um, I, as far as that, I won't go any further than that because there's so much that could be said, but I'll spare everyone. Again, I'd rather hear your thoughts on this. So the question is, right, if in the Gospel of John, this is just one possibility, right? If Mary's name is suppressed in order to emphasize some symbolism, well, then could it not be that Maryam is the only woman's name that appears in the Quran for a similar reason, to emphasize some symbolism in her person, right? And so
Yes,
phrasing that
yes,
as a
I
question,
do think so.
right? Right.
Yes, I really do think so because we do see the Christology, obviously, of the Gospels are different from one another
Yes.
because theologically, perhaps each author wanted to emphasize something differently. So the way Luke handles it is very different than the way John does it, but and apparently because each one wanted to emphasize something over another, not that they don't necessarily, um, uh, contradict each other or that they don't go hand in hand, but each one had a different message that they wanted to emphasize. And perhaps the Quran also only names Maryam as the only female name in the whole Quran. Perhaps there is this kind of theological emphasis it wants to convey, um, uh, and and we need to perhaps try to figure out. I mean, ever since you were talking about the mother of the book, al Kitab, and if that is associated with Maryam somehow, I mean, I've always been thinking because Maryam, according to the Quran, is al Kalima. She's the mother of the word.
Right.
And is al Kalima somehow perhaps related as to al Kitab or something like that? I mean, you got me wondering now.
Well, at least
I
according
really
to
need to.
Neuwirth, and personally, I find her argumentation not only plausible, it's very convincing. Um, and so, right, a mother, right, usually gives birth to a son, right, on the human level, but in the Quran, on the divine level, the mother gives birth to a kitab, a book.
Right.
Right. So there is some kind of parallelism or correspondence, but there is a difference. But in any case, um, I I would say just from to practice exegesis, right? To look at the text and try to figure out what the symbolism might be. I see two. There may be more, right? But I see two, and that is, well, we could say that she is functioning as a symbol of the divine mercy because of the intimate link with the divine name Rahman, and a symbol of sort of like an earthly counterpart of the heavenly Kitab, in by virtue of what Neuwirth just pointed out in Surah Imran, right? And is in any case extraordinarily fascinating, right? Theologically
Yeah.
viewed, right? Um, let's probably end on by returning to the basmala, right? Because that's we, as I've said, at least I tend to relate it with all of this we've been talking about. Um, the origins of it. Let's say if it's a divine echo, it could be an echo of more than just one previous uh, revelation, of course. So you mentioned one possibility. There's another that I think has to be included, and that is if one pulls out the Hebrew Bible, right, and looks at Exodus 33 and 34, right, this is very famous, right, at least in Judaism, very famous, where Moses um, is speaking with God, and God promises or tells Moses, I'm going to appear to you. I will appear before you. In Hebrew, it's like literally in front of your face, right? I'm going to appear in front of you, and I, that is God, I will pronounce my name, right? And so then, right, one reads a little bit, and then we read of this scene where God appears to Moses, and God speaks, and he says, Yod He Vav He El Rachum Wa Chanun, right? So tetragrammaton, that's, Yod He Vav He, twice, and then El, the short form of Elohim or God, and then we can translate it different ways, but I prefer merciful and gracious. Interestingly, both of those terms, Rachum and Hanan, are etymologically related to two different nouns in Hebrew that refer to the womb, that mean the womb, both of them.
Right.
Right. So usually the rachum is, most scholars know that, but if you study your etymology, you will find out that also chanan, this uh, grace, right, in Hebrew is also a cognate, is based on a synonym, right, for the womb. And but the verb in Hebrew, right, that this is introduced by, where God speaks, is vayikra, right? So it's the Hebrew cognate of ikra, right? Ikra, as we have in the Surah Alaq. So, um, so it seems to me that we at the basmala on the principal or primary echo is that of Exodus 34, verse 6, right? And this is something I recently had a conversation with Rabbi um, uh, Krishif he's in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he pointed out that this verse, that it's actually two verses, which are very important for Judaism. And so when God appears and he says, "Lord, Lord, God, merciful and compassionate," then some more synonyms for compassion, but then also the judgment side, right? God is also a God of judgment. Uh, he's merciful for 1,000 generations, but he doesn't forget sins for 3 generations, for up to 3 generations, right? So much more merciful than judgmental. But what the rabbi pointed out to me was that when you have later echoes of that passage in the Tanakh, for instance, in the Tehillim or the Psalms, the judgment part is left off. The echo is just God is merciful and gracious, or merciful and compassionate. And this is exactly what we have on the basmala. The judgment part is not there. It's just, right, Bismillah, Rahman Rahim. In the name of God, the merciful, compassionate. I mean, it's a philological point, but I think the Rahim is actually not a divine name. It's an adjectively understood modifying Rahman. But be that as it may, they're both undeniably cognate, right, etymologically, with the noun for womb. So in any case, it seems to me that the principal echo in the basmala is from that passage, right, which is it. I hesitate to say it because I'm not sure, but it may be it is one of the most important passages in the Hebrew Bible in Judaism. There's no doubt about that, and it's repeated so many times in the later books of the Hebrew Bible, in the Psalms, as I said, in the 12 prophets, the so-called minor prophets, and in the New Testament, in the letter of James, it's repeated again. The judgment part is left off. So, so in that sense, I think we could say that what happened there in the later books of the Hebrew Bible is a divine anticipation, right, of what we see in the basmala. The judgment part is left off. No, it's not totally absent because it shows up later in the first surah, right? The Yom al-Din, the Day of Judgment, right? So there is the judgment there, but the principal essence of the divine, right? According to me, if you look at the basmala, it would appear that this is what is really implying that the essence of it all is this divine mercy. How can we understand mercy? Well, we're humans. We have to see things and process them intellectually. We can see a mother who bears a child and she treats it with kindness and love. And right, if we remember the Aramaic cognate, right, it also means love. So I think there is a valence of love in this divine name, Rahman, even in Arabic. Hopefully, I do hope that one day the lexica are going to reflect that, right? There is some scholarly discussion about it, but I think lexically the Arabic probably does contain that valence as well, right? Because what is mercy? People saw that mothers treated the fruit of their womb, let's say, their children, the little infant, with kindness, tenderness, love, mercy. And so it was viewing that very concrete reality and situation that then leads to the abstract notion of love and mercy. So the abstract is actually based on the concrete. And of course, in linguistics, that's the way we think too. Like nouns are derived from verbs usually. Anyway, so I don't know if you have any reaction to that that will be suitable for at least approaching an end here tonight. So I don't want to keep you up too late
Well,
there.
well, I think you're. I mean, I think there could be something to it, and the way how you see the basmala, perhaps also echoing, the narrative between Moses and how God presents God's self to Moses, and how you then say that every time the later books of the Hebrew Bible, when they want to, as you use the word echo
Mm,
this, they leave out the judgment part. This reminds me that in the Quran there's a passage in Surah Al-Ma'idah which basically says that no, that God is, very strong in punishment, shadidul
mm,
iqab. But then it continues and says, وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ, and God
yes.
is like basically forgives and merciful, and uses the word rahim here, just as in the
Mm,
basmala, for example. And as you say, that maybe how the basmala itself perhaps shows no punishment, or so shows no judgment, and it's just, it's the love, as you say, it's the love of, the mother, the love of the womb,
mm,
for the and yeah, I think, I mean, because that again also, it circles back again to Gospel of John chapter 3.
mm,
It's immediately after, the speech between the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus.
mm,
It's where it says, and God so loved the world. So you have the word love in here. It's,
right.
the love of the mother, the motherly love, the
Mm,
womb, which is giving, this. So I think there is a lot to it.
mm,
And yes, so you do have this divine femininity in there, which is the compassion, the love, the
mm,
mercy, and there is no judgment in the basmala. So uh, yeah, I think very much so. I actually, in my other book, which is about the Hajj,
mm,
uh, I actually had originally, in the original manuscript, I had a section which talks about divine sexuality, and I talk about both divine masculinity and divine femininity, and how the Hajj sometimes can symbolize this kind of divine
mm,
sexuality. Do think the Quran has perhaps this kind of divine sexuality, not again solely femininity, but also masculinity.
mm,
Even in the symbolism of the Hajj, for example, we do see both. the femininity and the masculinity.
I'd say very quickly that there are actually many traditional authorities in Sunni Islam, at least that I've read, right, that recognize, right, that the in Judaism, when we talk about God as the Father, right, this is not meant biologically, right, um, and it can be used in the sense of a creator, right? And so it doesn't have to be something understood biologically, physically, right? Because that's a lot
Right.
of theologians and the pious Muslims. That's of course, a legitimate reservation when it comes to this type of terminology. But so so there is some traditional warrant, right, for quote unquote going there, right? As long as we qualify terms in certain ways, but you would know more about that than I would.
It's perhaps there is obviously some symbolism in the Quran and in the rituals as well on
Mhm,
divine femininity, but also divine masculinity. And
mhm,
when we want to do some kind of like comparison, like comparative theology with Hinduism, I mean, again, as I was saying before, it's like the lingam and the yoni of the
mhm,
symbolism of Shiva, of what it represents, the unity or the union, not the unity, but the union of the masculine and the feminine as the power to create and bring
mhm,
about life.
mhm,
It's this
mhm.
creative power.
Yes, well, it's perhaps one way of viewing this is that the paternal metaphor, right, is is let's say subtle, remains at a subtle level, right, in the Quran, perhaps because of the whole issue, right, of the notion of the Son of God and the biological implications, or however we explain that. And for this reason, at least I would suspect that it is this reason that the metaphor, divine metaphor of the al Kitab, for instance, is dominant, and it's a virginal mother. So you have a son, or for the Christians, but you have a kitab from the mother, but she's a virginal mother. So you don't need a father, right? So for the purposes of, on the level, the plane of revelation, this is the role of virginity. So the father is not needed because of this extraordinary, right, virginal uh, conception, right, of the heavenly kitab. So perhaps that's one way of looking at it, right? What is the dominant symbolism, and why is it dominant? So right, so it may or may not be the case, but for me, it seems that the feminine would be the dominant metaphor, since it does occur explicitly and with two divine names ascribed to it. Whereas what you're discussing may be clear, but subtly clear, if that makes sense, right? And there
Yes.
may be maybe some theological reason for that we're not aware of, or that you may be aware of it, but that I may not be aware of. Each religion, right, has its own reason for being and its own emphases, and yet each religion also has, along with the major emphases, a lot of subtleties, right, and esoteric motifs that at times do become exoteric, right? Um, in mysticism, for instance, and esoteric thought, right, which then makes the esoteric exoteric, which sort of makes you wonder, are the two the same in the end? Which in Judaism it actually is. The Peshet coincides with the Sod, because where does the Sod come from? Right, the mystical interpretation is really nothing but taking a hyper literal understanding of the Peshet. Certainly, what you showed us, about the name Zachariah, right, and the mercy, and that actually seems pretty clear to me that there is this masculine feminine polarity, right, and interaction that's definitely playing a role, and more subtle, right, would be that is congruent with the background in the story of Hannah, right, and right, the barrenness and then the conception of the son. By the way, one last clarification on the basmala and being an echo of Exodus 34 is that we have in the Hebrew text there where God says, and I will, uh, well, and I will yikra, which means call upon, right? I will call upon, it's in Hebrew, yikra v'shem, yod he vav he, and the ba, is the, what's called the beth essentiae, so it's not translated. So I will call the name of the Lord, his God's own name. And so there's this connection between the basmala and the opening of Surah Alaq, right? And
Right.
there, the bet is, I believe, the Arabic equivalent, the Ba Zaid, right? The bet. So it's call the name of your Lord, right, or proclaim the name of your Lord, rather than proclaim in the name. So both of those are actually, I think, echoing the divine echo, the same passage in Exodus, um, and creatively using it once, uh, in the sense of the Beth Essentiae, and in the other sense, right, with the prepositional, right, in the name of God, right, the merciful, the compassionate, merciful one. All right,
Yes,
I,
and
I
I can end with one thing also um, to basically also agree with, perhaps, how the divine feminine, or like the role of the divine feminine, has a big role,
mm,
or a very dominant role, as you say. The Surah An-Nisa, which is the fourth chapter in the Quran,
mm,
actually starts with uh, God creating,
mhm,
and then God creating a nafs, which is the soul. So God basically says, you're that God created you from a single soul. And because the
mm,
word nafs in the Semitic languages is a feminine,
mm.
so it continues and says, and from it, or from her
From her.
specifically,
Hmm.
because the nafs is feminine as a term. So from her, he created her mate. And through both, God spread many men and women.
Mm,
And then basically says, so be mindful of God, whose name you appeal to one another, or specifically using the word al-arham, which means, the family ties, those coming from
yes,
the same womb.
yes.
So here we do see, the nafs being feminine, al-arham being the womb, and it has this dominant role in creation. So I wouldn't disagree with your idea that maybe the Quran has the divine feminine, or the its role,
Mhm.
generally speaking, in creation, and so forth. So yes, in a not in a subtle way, but in a much more explicit way, as you say.
Right, and which to me, more or less manifestly, it's for me clearly, rather clearly, um, right, is based on. Again, we have a divine, the Katab, right? It says the Katab, which is who is with us, right? So with God, right? And so that makes us think of the opening of the Gospel of John, actually, where the Logos is with pros, with God or towards God, right? But this Khatab, or this heavenly entity, personified entity of revelation, or immediately calls to mind Lady Wisdom, or Chokhmah, right? In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, very famously, right? She says that she was with God in the beginning. So a hint there at the opening of the Torah, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so this figure of Lady Wisdom, right, who is identified as the Torah, right, in rabbinic tradition, but already it's hinted at in the Hebrew Bible. So rabbinic tradition didn't create this out of nothing, right? Um, this becomes increasingly important in Judaism, right? So you can say this Lady Wisdom equals Lady Torah, and the Torah, right, becomes the center of rabbinic Judaism, which has biblical precedent. Just the 119th Psalm. It's the longest chapter in the Bible, even if you include the New Testament there. It's the longest chapter in the Bible. And it's every verse, I think it's 176 verses. Every single verse is a praise of the Torah. And many things that elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible are said only of God, in that chapter are said of the Torah. I will raise my hands to the Torah, right? I will love the Torah with all my heart, is right. The Shema is being echoed there. So, but if we keep in mind that this Torah, right, which is the center of rabbinic Judaism, is really, right, a manifestation of Lady Wisdom, right? And so, what's the relationship between that, right, and God, right, who in Judaism is called the Father? Um, so it seems to me that that's the background being echoed throughout the Quran when it's this issue of the Kitab is coming up, and it's somehow being exemplified or explained with the person of Mary, who is a virgin mother, who has a son, and somehow that son is corresponding to that Kitab, the heavenly Kitab or revelation. Anyway,
Right.
I'm sure we could go on for quite a long time on this. And utterly fascinating, and doubly uh, grateful, right, to you, Abdullah, for the time you
Well,
spent here tonight.
thank you so much, Samuel. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your time and being very, very gracious as well.
All right. Well, all best wishes, right, for you and your life and your work.
Well, thank you, and God bless you.
Oh, thank you. God bless you too.